Formula One, over its prestigious 70-year history, has gone through numerous regulation changes every 5 years or so in order to shake up the field and reshape the competitive order. Now, sometimes these regulation changes make the cars go quicker on the previous year, and sometimes they make the cars go slower, and then every evolution sometimes gets quicker or slower in the same way. So in this video, we will be analysing the progression of Formula One from 1950 to 2020, using over 14,500 data points from both qualifying and the races. And this almost 3-month data gathering project has resulted in this graph here. This graph denotes the time loss of each year down to 2020, the most recent completed season of Formula One. So we have 1950 being almost 70 seconds per lap slower than our present day Formula One cars. If we were to take a look at just the 1950s, each year on average was gaining 2.9 seconds on its previous year. But comparing that to the 1960s, this was almost 1.6 seconds. The 1970s, this was under a second. The 1980s, this was almost 7/10, to where we get to the 1990s, where there is almost no progression whatsoever. The cars are almost as quick as each other throughout an entire decade. However, heading through the early 2000s and the 2010s, we end up with almost 4/10 improvements on average per year, and into the 2020s, this is just over 2/10. There is an extremely large amount of data, like I said, 14,500 data points from 3 individual data streams that have gone into producing this graph here. However, it really is worth looking at the relevant rule changes that happened within each decade, and then pinpoint exactly where the speed increases have really come from. So if we just take a look at the first 2 decades of Formula One, where we almost saw 5 seconds of improvement per year from 1950 to 1970. That zoomed in section would look a little something like this here, where the 1950s cars was 70 seconds slower than present day, all the way up until the 1960s cars, where they were almost 30 seconds slower than present day. And the main regulation changes which happened in this year were all to do with the engine size. So at the very beginning of the formula, engines were limited to 1,500cc with a compressor, or a naturally aspirated 4,500cc engine, with the next regulation change decreasing this by almost half, 750cc with a compressor and 2,500 naturally aspirated. And we can see it was in this second regulation change where the first monumental lap time changes actually started to occur, where they were gaining almost 4 seconds year on year, right up until the next engine regulation change where it made commercial petrol compulsory and the burning of alcohol-based fuels were banned. And since this regulation change, we can see a small decrease in the time gained on the previous years. It's gone from almost 4 seconds per year to around 2 seconds per year. Formula One then ended up banning compressors, only allowing naturally aspirated engines between 1300 and 1500cc, and for the first time it introduced a maximum weight for the car of 450 kilos. With the first year of this new maximum weight regulation change being considerably slower than its predecessor. However, time gains were once again sought after by the engineers, where by the end of the 1960s, compressors made a return, again 1500cc or 3000 this time for a naturally aspirated engine, and there was set a minimum weight this time of 500 kilos. Then heading into the next 2 decades worth of regulation changes, we can see that the early 1970s cars were 23 seconds slower than present day, all the way up to the end of the 1980s where they were just 9 seconds slower than present day. With the main regulation changes that came through the 1970s and 80s were weight regulations, with the minimum weight being increased to 530 kilos, in addition to having safer fuel tanks. The year after this, the minimum weight was then set to 550, with this again increasing by 25 kilos, as well as banning chrome plating. And we can see that during this regulation change, there was actually a stagnation in the improvement year on year. But not until we reach Niki Lauda's accident of 1976, where airboxes were banned, engine cooling was significantly limited, and there were increased safety structures. However, we saw a dramatic increase in the pace of the cars in this period of time, where the cars were on average gaining nearly 2 seconds per year on their previous years. However, with the next regulation change, it gets a little bit choppy. There are time losses and time gains in the adjacent years, where rotary, diesel, gas turbine and Sarek orbital engines were all banned, with rigid skirts legalised and ride height restrictions were removed. Then towards the latter stage of the 1980s, race refueling was banned, the rear wing sizes were limited, and crash tests were made mandatory, with the minimum weight being reduced to 500 kilos, and again this sort of stagnated the progression year on year. Where in the late stages of the 1980s, turbo engines were banned. But it wasn't until the midpoint of this graph here where we actually start to see more rigid and inflexible regulations. This was the period of time where Bernie Ecclestone and Max Mosley took over the whole Formula 1 entity and started to form it into the sport that we know it is today. We're finally heading into the last 3 decades of Formula 1 racing. We can see it is extremely choppy, with time losses and time gains seemingly coming at a random place. However, if we go all the way back to the 1990s, the front wing was narrowed, the rear tyre width was reduced, and the rear wing was also made smaller. However, this did actually result in the cars going ever so slightly quicker, but nowhere near as significantly as in previous decades. To the point where at 1994 they actually went 2 seconds slower than in 1993. And it was at this point where the driver aids were actually banned. This included active suspension, traction control, ABS, and launch control. This significantly reduced this era's cars until the engineers managed to find their ways around it, to the point where again they were gaining around 2 seconds on the previous years. And just before the new millennium, the groove tyres were brought into the sport and flexi wings were banned. As if we haven't had enough chatter about flexi wings in present day Formula 1. However, it was in the early 2000s that we saw monumental pace gains, to the point where they were actually level, if not quicker, than the present day era of Formula 1 racing cars. This was of course where they had the V10 engines, as well as bringing back traction control. The cars were going so fast in this era of Formula 1. Gaining on average 1.5 to 2 seconds per year up until 2004. Where at 2005 the diffuser size was reduced, the engine was also reduced to a V8 and restrictions on RPM were implemented. And it was after this set of regulation changes where the cars started to get a little bit slower by around half a second per year. Then from 2009 onwards, all aerodynamic devices / fins were banned in a massive simplification of the cars, as well as the introduction of KERS. However, interestingly, throughout this period, up until 2011 when the tyre manufacturer Pirelli came into the sport, the cars were actually going slower than their previous years. Right up until what we know as today as the modern era of Formula 1, where the V6 turbo hybrid era begins in 2014. The cars progressively got quicker and quicker throughout this year, up until the 2017 major regulation change, where the cars were made significantly wider, with vastly increased downforce. So being able to properly visualise the massive and monumental progression of Formula 1 from 1950 all the way through to present day, along with the actual regulation changes that went alongside that, causing the progression, is absolutely stunning. It just goes to show the absolute leaps and bounds that the engineers and the design teams around each edition of these Formula 1 cars are willing to go to push the boundaries of what is possible with the regulation changes that they are given. Now, just for those people who are interested in exactly where these numbers have come from, I'm going to now go through exactly how I have calculated all of this. But first we need to take a look at the same graph that we saw at the beginning, however split into its 3 individual data streams. Fastest laps in the blue, qualifying in the orange, and then race pace going all the way back to 1996 in the grey, which overlaps with the blue line. And we can actually see very clear trends between all of this data. Where it decreases in speed, the other one decreases in speed from fastest laps through to qualifying, and this happens at every single stage of this series. Apart from 1966 by this yellow arrow here, where the fastest lap speed actually decreased, however qualifying just above it increased. But other than that, these 3 data streams really do correlate with each other, to produce the first graph that we saw at the top of this video. So now let's quickly walk through exactly how I've come to work out the massive differences and the monumental progression of Formula 1 since 1950. So first off, we need to pull up the most recent calendar of 2020 and then the previous year next to it, 2019. So step number 1 with these two calendars is to isolate any rainy races. This was Hungary 2020, Turkey 2020, and Germany 2019. With these races identified, we then need to match them up with their opposing years. So we need to highlight as well Hungary of 2019 as we are unable to compare it due to the rainy race in Hungary 2020. Then because of the massive calendar changes that happened through to 2020, Turkey and Germany were not on each other's calendar. Then after isolating the rainy races, we then need to highlight the races that were at the same circuit. There were 8: Austria, Great Britain, Spain, Belgium, Italy, Russia, Bahrain, and Abu Dhabi. Then from here it is quite simple. We just pull up those circuits that matched between each year. We then find their qualifying times at those circuits from 2020, the qualifying times in 2019, then we calculate the difference, and then calculate that in terms of a percentage. Then all we need to do is just average out each of these columns, and we find out that the qualifying pace across these 8 rounds in 2020 was an 84.597 compared to an 84.95 in 2019, so a 3.5 qualifying difference in 2020's favour. Exactly the same process is then done for the fastest laps, so the fastest laps from 2020 compared to the fastest laps of 2019 at these 8 circuits. The difference is then calculated, and interestingly in 2020 and 2019 around Austria, they both set the same fastest lap. This difference is then calculated in terms of a percentage, and the average is given, where interestingly 2019 was 3.5 faster. So 2020 had a 3.5 difference in qualifying, however it was slower in terms of the fastest laps. And in total, after finding all of the matching races that have happened between each adjacent calendar, I've looked at just under 700 races for this entire Formula 1 history. However, moving into the slightly more complex one, the actual race pace data, all the way back to 1996, this is where the main bulk of the data points have actually come from. So after identifying the races that are matching from 2020 to 2019, we then need to find out who won those races. We then need to pull up their lap times throughout that Grand Prix. So on screen is the Austria 2020 lap times for the race winner, which was Valtteri Bottas. And in total around this circuit, there were 71 laps. And step number 1 is to manually remove lap number 1, any safety car periods, and any pit stops. And this reduces our lap pool from 71 down to 55. From here, the slowest 30% are then removed, in addition to the fastest 2. Then from here, the slowest 30% are then removed, in addition to the fastest 2, which decreases our lap count from 55 to 47. These remaining 47 laps are then averaged, and we end up with a lap time of 68.749 around Austria. We're doing exactly the same process for Austria 2019, manually removing any safety car periods, pit stops and lap number 1, removing the slowest 30% and the fastest 2, and averaging what's left. We end up with a 68.549, a 0.2 difference between the years. So once again, filling all of this data into this little table here across the 8 circuits, we can pull up 2020's average race lap times here along with 2019's. Again, calculating the difference between these years, and then as a percentage as well. Then averaging all of these out, we end up with an average lap time of 2020 of a 91.016, and 1.5 quicker per lap was 2019, a 90.847. Then all that's left to do is to repeat this step all the way back to 1950. However, my lap time database only goes back to 1996. There are no recorded database lap times at all for 1995 back to 1950. So between those 2 years, I just had to primarily rely on the qualifying and fastest lap data. But there we go, there has been a progression of Formula One's improvements from 1950 all the way up to present day Formula One. This has been a mammoth project that I've worked on for almost 3 months now, and it has consisted of over 14,000 data points to create these graphs and visuals that you have seen. If there is any further information that you would like to know regarding this video, then please do let me know in the comments down below. I'll be more than happy to engage and talk to you guys about the astonishing progression of Formula One. But that is all I've got for you today, guys. I do hope you have enjoyed, and I'll catch you in the next video with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.